Okay, I am very sorry that it has been a minute since the last video in this series. Life has been very busy for me, and I am tired. Burnout is a bitch, but still doing what I can. Just wanted to get the next video in the series out. If the next few videos take a while, I apologize. I have a job now and I'm busy with it, so sorry about that. But I will start by talking about a game that I didn't get to talk about in a previous video because I didn't play it before the previous video, and some people might wonder if you look at my backlog page, where was this game? And that's Ratchet & Clank Size Matters, which would have landed in the Just Missed the Cut section. This game recently got a re-release on PS5, and I decided to try it out. I have some qualms with it. It's got its faults, but I think it is interesting how well they were able to jam a console-style Ratchet & Clank game onto the PSP, and I think that's what made the PSP such an interesting system, that it had these console-style games on it. And I think the re-release is worth trying out. It does have its issues, yes, but overall it's a pretty solid game. So yeah, I just wanted to start with that before we get into the proper video, but welcome back to I Want to Talk About, the series where I take a topic, I sit on camera, and I blabber about it. And as you can tell from the title today, I want to talk about my favorite video games of 2011. You know how the series goes at this point. I introduce the year in gaming, talk about what the landscape of gaming looked like at the time, some notable events. I talk about some big games I didn't get to play, some games that I did play but just missed the cut of my two main lists, so some games that I thought were like a 7 out of 10. Then I get into the two main lists, the first being the cream before the crop, games that I would give like an 8 or 9 out of 10 to that I enjoyed but didn't really consider my all-time favorites, and then my proper best list of 10 out of 10 games. And obviously, as we get further into the 2010s and eventually the last few years of the 2020s before we get to the current era, the lists are going to get longer and longer just because I've happened to play more games that have come out since 2010 onward. So because of that, let's not make this intro super long, let's jump right in. 2011 was another year I look back on very fondly in my personal life. There were some good things about that year, even though there were a couple downsides on a personal level, but the one side that was a big thing in 2011 that was awesome was the world of gaming. In my opinion, 2011 is one of the better years in gaming, and a year that I and many others look back on incredibly fondly. Truly, in my opinion, one of the finest years in gaming. But you don't have to take my word for it. I'm sorry, I had been begging to put in some kind of Reading Rainbow joke in this video, in this series somewhere, so I kind of forced it, but screw it, there it is. I did it. Anyway, to introduce the console gaming landscape and the three main consoles in 2011, this time the first one I'm going to talk about is Microsoft, because the Xbox 360 was actually the highest selling system in 2011. Not to say that the 360 wasn't successful before that, of course it was, but this was the first time that the 360 had been the highest selling console of a given year since its launch. It kind of appears that even as Xbox's lineup was becoming so incredibly Kinect-centric, much to the chagrin of many hardcore gamers, the short-term benefits were there in spades. I mean, apparently this thing was a Guinness World Record holder at the time for being the fastest-selling consumer electronics device. It apparently sold 8 million units in its first 60 days. So suddenly a lot of people were really interested in Xbox, especially casual gamers. Oh, and it does help that Gears of War 3 dropped that year. Yeah, I'm not a huge Gears fan, but that obviously helped. As far as Sony, the PlayStation 3 wasn't that far behind in sales. 14.9 million for the 360, 14.1 million for the PS3 from what my research tells me. And it was seeing a lot of success in 2011. Some of that in spite of itself. Because 2011, if many of you remember, was the year of the notorious PlayStation Network outage, where 77 million PlayStation Network accounts were compromised, including this guy's. Well, actually, it was my brother's, but still, I remember being there and seeing it firsthand when it happened. And I don't think we lost anything in particular, but still, it was a pretty big deal. It was pretty much impossible to log on to PlayStation Network because of it, and Sony basically had to disable the servers for weeks on end to get control of it. It was a very wonky time for PlayStation, and it's wild then that one of the most notorious cybersecurity attacks in recent memory didn't stop people from buying PlayStation 3s. Guess that's what the power of good games does. Oh, but the PSP was basically gasping for air, so it's not like people were just buying anything that had the word PlayStation on it, so there's that, I guess. On the Nintendo front, the Wii actually fell behind both the 360 and the PS3 in terms of sales for what felt like the first time. Maybe it wasn't, but it was feeling like it was the first time. And while it still sold units and probably made Nintendo some dough thanks to its affordability and the fact that it didn't cost a ton to manufacture, it seemed like 2011 was the time where the Wii was truly being seen as a fad. And with the knowledge of the next console being on the way, people just probably naturally stopped buying Wiis in anticipation of the upcoming system. Though speaking of new systems, 2011 did see the release of Nintendo's next handheld, the Nintendo 3DS. I did kind of spoil in one of my previous videos what the next handheld was after the DS, but yeah, you guys probably already knew it anyway, so it's not really a spoiler. But yes, this was another iteration of the Nintendo DS line, only this time, it was in 3D! Oh yeah, right, a big technological topic from the early 2010s that I didn't talk about, but I could probably devote a whole video to it if I wanted to. 3D! Yes, I have quite an interest in 3D, probably more than most human beings do at this point in time. And in the early 2010s, 3D was becoming incredibly popular all over again. Obviously, James Cameron's Avatar came out in 2009 and really pushed how we looked at 3D to the point where every film studio was chomping at the bit to put out their movies in 3D, even if they were not filmed or conceived or written with 3D in mind, and studios were just lazily post-converting the movies to 3D just to make a quick buck. And not to say post-converted 3D can't be good, it's just that in the case of things like this, or this, or this, it wasn't as good. But 3D was also reaching gaming as well. You'll probably notice it, at least on a few of the boxes that I show in this video, and probably some in the last video, but a lot of games were starting to become 3D compatible. The PS3 even received an update to be 3D compatible, and this wasn't even Nintendo's first rodeo in 3D gaming. I mean, yeah, we could talk about the crap that was the Virtual Boy, but originally the GameCube was going to be a 3D console. They had an add-on that was going to allow it to play in stereoscopic 3D, but from what I understand, the add-on would have cost more than the console itself, so you can see why they pulled the plug fairly quickly. Now with the 3DS on the other hand, yes, it was 3D, but in this case, you didn't even have to wear glasses. You just needed to have laser beams for eyes. Yeah, it was pretty powerful stuff, to the point where at the time Nintendo was pretty much saying that if you were, I think, 6 or 7 years old, that you basically weren't allowed to play the thing in 3D. And they even had a slider on the screen to adjust how dramatic the 3D effect could be, because they probably knew that if you turned it all the way up, it was going to be hard for your eyes to adjust. Ironically though, while this thing became just as much a household name as any other Nintendo handheld, because Nintendo's handhelds have always sold a lot, it had a pretty miserable start. The launch price was high and the early lineup was rough, and ultimately it was looking pretty bad for Nintendo, at least at first. Fortunately, they got their act together fairly quickly, slashed the price, offered early adopters such as myself 10 free NES and Game Boy Advance games, and they started coming through with a steady lineup of games. Many of those games we're going to talk about in this video, and even some in other videos, because while I've mentioned a lot that I'm not a huge handheld gamer, I have a lot of fond memories with the 3DS, and like many Nintendo systems, it's home to a pretty kick-ass library of games. Even though, yes, the whole 3D part of it, the big gimmick that sold the thing, would really become de-emphasized over time. But we'll get to that when we get to it. As far as third-party stuff, there wasn't a ton that I was able to find. I mean, Twitch did see its official launch, and that was pretty cool. That was a pretty big deal. Obviously, Twitch is still the big popular streaming platform for gaming now. But while 2011 was a great year with a lot of great games, it was a particularly tough one for an area that is really popular in terms of gaming, perhaps the epicenter of gaming, Japan. Stepping outside of the gaming-specific sphere for a minute into real-world events, 2011 was the year of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. My apologies if I pronounced the name wrong, which was a very big deal. I remember hearing about it a lot on the news back then, and naturally something of the magnitude of said natural disaster was going to have a huge economic impact in Japan. Consider, of course, like I said, that Japan is basically the video game epicenter, and the video game industry is also Japan's most well-known economic medium. Of course, everything is going to slow down in an environment like that, where there were somewhere in the ballpark of 20,000 casualties. And even though many Japanese gaming companies were located far enough away from the disaster, thus thankfully no employees were casualties, that's not to say there weren't families or friends of these folks that were impacted, and again, the economy had to be wrecked pretty hard by it. So as a result, several games were delayed, some even outright canceled if their topics and events were too close to what had actually happened. And that's on top of games having a lot of shipment issues and things like that in Japan, even if they weren't made by Japanese companies. It's honestly a wonder that Japanese publishers and developers, who will be solidly represented in this video, don't you worry, were still able to put out quality games in 2011, and a good amount of them, given that this kind of climate couldn't have been easy to develop in. And I feel like that's definitely a story that has to be talked about in the context of 2011 in gaming, because again, Japan is incredibly important in the gaming sphere, perhaps the most important country in the gaming sphere. And I mean, that was a huge story back then, and obviously it had a huge impact on the gaming industry. But now, at risk of a bit of an awkward transition, we can get to talking about the games themselves. And there were a few games that were huge in 2011 that I didn't really get to play myself that are pretty notable snubs. Getting through them very quickly, these are two of 2011's biggest games, but they're just games that never really, I guess, grabbed me necessarily. The first of them, perhaps the most iconic of them, is Skyrim, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Obviously a game that people talk about all the time today, that people love, but again, I've mentioned that I'm not huge into Bethesda Game Studios games, so I didn't really play this outside of, like, playing it one time in VR. And then there was also Portal 2, which I am just not that into puzzle games like this. When it comes to puzzle games, I'm more of a Tetris type, so puzzle adventure games like this aren't really my thing. But obviously that, along with Skyrim, are super important games, and I feel like you can't talk about 2011 without at least mentioning these games at least once. Now, as far as games in the just missed the cut section, the 7 out of 10 type section, I have two here. The first of them being Bulletstorm, one of the stupidest games I've ever played, but also one that I find quite fun. Definitely a game that I feel like you gotta turn your brain off to, though, let that be known. And it turns out I am bringing back the licensed game stuff here, because 2011 was also the year of a game that I actually quite enjoyed, even if it probably won't top many other lists. SpongeBob SquigglePants 3D. One of the first 3DS games that I ever owned at a time when, like I said, the library was pretty light. And while it is an obvious WarioWare clone, it honestly has enough SpongeBob charm on its own to make it pretty interesting. If you could find it somewhere, I definitely suggest checking it out. So now let's get to the cream before the crop, because we have a lot of games to cover in that section, a lot of games that I really enjoyed in 2011. So let's not waste any more time and let's jump in. That's right, I am starting this section by talking about a mod. I haven't really done that yet, but this is the first time I'm doing it. If I get the ban hammer from Nintendo for discussing something like this, it's been a pleasure. Okay, I don't think it'll be that bad, but yes, Project M was a huge deal back in the early to mid 2010s. For those that don't know what it is, Project M is basically a mod, or was a mod, of Super Smash Bros. Brawl that basically gave it the fast-paced gameplay mechanics of Super Smash Bros. Melee. Some of you may remember I talked about it in the 2008 video, but Brawl really took out a lot of the mechanics that made Melee special, slowed the game down, added random tripping. So Project M was basically an attempt to bring Brawl's mechanics closer to what Melee's were. Initially, it was born out of a desire to just make Falco play like he did in Melee, but it ended up transforming into a full-scale rework that even brought back Mewtwo and Roy, two characters who were cut from Brawl, and it added a bevy of new features and content to basically feel like a huge celebration of Smash Bros. And it was pretty big back in the day, to the point where major tournaments were basically coming along that were outdoing the attendance of Brawl tournaments. The kind of death, so to speak, of Brawl's mainstream competitive scene, which was going to be coming soon anyway because of another Smash game coming out in a few years' time, that death was kind of sped along because players moved on to Project M. Melee players are playing it, and Brawl players pretty much moved on to it en masse. And it did see its development cut short before some new content came along because of some fear of a Nintendo lawsuit, of course. But the game was still a lot of fun back in the day, and it was cool to see what the fans were able to do with it back in the 2010s. And many of their best laid plans would eventually come true, but of course, as I like to say, more on that later. Don't worry, even though MLB The Show games are going to land on this portion of the list for the next few videos, I won't be bringing it up in every video from here on out, and they're not going to end up on the best lists proper anymore. There's just not any other real 10 out of 10s in the series after MLB 10. But yes, yearly sports game mention, and MLB 11 The Show was another entry that I put a lot of time into back in the day, especially because it added a lot of new and interesting features to the formula. This was the first game to use analog controls, which I don't really use myself, but it was cool for them to add something like that, as it added some new challenge and layers to the gameplay. And it also actually used the PlayStation Move, which was only for Home Run Derby, but that didn't mean I didn't play the hell out of it. I mentioned it before that I'm a sucker for motion-controlled baseball games, so yeah, that was kind of right up my alley. Oh yeah, and the game was playable in 3D. Again, expect me to kind of repeat that at points throughout these videos, or just expect to see it somewhere on the box. Even with MLB The Show being at the top of its game, it was still coming through with nice changes that continued to make it the best baseball franchise in gaming, point blank, period. And MLB 11 was another solid entry in the franchise. Here we are, my favorite entry in the Infamous franchise. Not to say that the next one isn't good, of course, it's great, but Infamous 2 is still my favorite entry in the Infamous series. It was a great step forward for the franchise despite coming so quickly after the first game, only 2 years later. Taking it all together, it's a bigger, smoother, and all-around better version of the first Infamous game, and quite frankly, what more could you ask for? The first Infamous already laid a great groundwork. It was just a game that I think needed a little bit of polish, and thankfully that's what Sucker Punch did here. Polish, 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 polish. The combat is even more exciting this time around, the traversal and platforming are even better than the first game, and even though Empire City was a great open world to explore in the first game, I think New Marais is even better and more fun to explore. They pretty much, like I said, just took everything about the first game and made it across the board better. It's a game that I think still stands tall among some of the PlayStation 3's best titles, and it's a game, again, I think that everyone should play. I still wish Sony would reissue this game and the first game on modern platforms, because it's a shame that you can't really play it on PS4 or 5. Maybe outside of cloud versions, but I don't count those cloud versions. Like, what? Cloud gaming? Come on, get out of here. But either way, Infamous 2, great game. Definitely play it if you haven't already. But wait, Matthew, you proclaim using my full name. Very bold of you. You put both the PSP God of War games in the Just Missed the Cut section. How does this collection end up in the cream before the crop? Well, because I'm looking at this as a collection and not for the overall quality of the games included. Because yes, I do still have my feelings on the PSP God of War games, but as a re-release, God of War Origins Collection is great. And I feel like if you're going to jump into the PSP God of War games, this is how you should do it. Even though the games were originally made for handhelds, it's a pretty natural transition back to consoles, especially given that, again, the handheld they were made for was basically trying to be a console, so it was easy to kind of translate the handheld games to the console. And the remastering job is pretty nice, especially for two PSP games that were basically blown up to be on a home console. They're not the most essential games ever, but if you are looking to play them, I definitely recommend playing them through this collection. Or, and we will talk about this at some point, play them through the God of War saga that came out on PS3 that has the entire series, outside of Ascension. But yeah, play that. I think that's a really good collection. But again, more on that later. I still remember the general reception when Skylanders Spyros Adventure was announced. It was something to the effect of, "Fuck you, Activision, I'm gonna bomb Studio, I'm gonna kill the families of everyone who works there, you fucking cunt, fuck them!" People were mad. And look, I understand that it wasn't the Spyro game we all wanted at the time, but come on, people were genuinely threatening to bomb Activision and Toys for Bob's development studios because of this game. And I get it, Activision sucks. But bombing the studio because of a game like this? I don't often like to use the "it's for kids" excuse with a lot of media because I find that to be pretty reductive, but seriously, this is a game that is made to appeal to young audiences and people wanted to commit arson over it. That just seems way too extreme. But back in the day, I actually ended up giving it a chance, and I actually quite enjoyed it. No, it wasn't really a Spyro game, and it definitely wasn't what I wanted out of the Spyro series. And yes, it was definitely gimmicky with its whole buy the toys, put it on the portal, have them come to life in the game, and spend a bunch of extra money on toys concept. But I think it was a cute game with some nice visuals, a charming cast of characters, and some pretty solid level design and nice RPG elements thrown in there as well. There are issues. I don't really understand why there was no jump button in a game where you do platforming, and I think the sequels would do what this game did a lot better. But I do think that Skylanders Spyros Adventure is a fun little game that started a franchise I quite enjoyed back in the day. And one that I will continue to talk about through this series, but again, let's hold our horses till we get to that point. Okay, so I know I might make a few people a little bit upset with my opinion on this one, but it's time for me to give a little eensy-weensy bit of a hot take. Batman Arkham City is actually my least favorite of the main Arkham games. I feel bad saying that because I know it's often considered to be the best one, and to many people the best superhero game ever, but out of the three main ones that Rocksteady developed, it's honestly my least favorite of the bunch. Granted, it's not my least favorite DC-based Rocksteady developed game in general, but oh man, I didn't even want to talk about it and now it's sitting here staring at you all. Go away, go away. Come, that one. There, that, back, this one. Either way, there are some elements of Batman Arkham City that just didn't really click for me, as while I think the open world is amazingly designed, something about it just didn't really sing to me. And I don't know what it is that I felt like the game was a little clunky at some points. I don't know, maybe I just suck at the game and I can fully acknowledge that, but yeah, I don't know. But don't let that make you think the wrong thing though, because Arkham City is still a great game. It's quite a marvel, no pun intended, just how much they were able to expand upon Arkham Asylum with this game, and the sheer depth of what this game accomplished from a technical perspective was pretty tremendous. It's amazing how much Rocksteady really respected Batman all throughout this game, and it was a game that did far more than really any comic-based game was doing at the time. And even to this day, it feels like a lot of superhero and comic book-based games don't do it like Arkham City did it. Sure, it might not be my favorite of the bunch, but this is still a great game that I'd highly recommend checking out. And hey, maybe now that I don't actually have a backlog and I've got nothing to play, I'll give the Arkham games a replay, and maybe I'll end up enjoying Arkham City even more. Who's to say? Here's a franchise that it feels like we haven't talked about in quite a few videos. Kirby! This was a game that I had been looking forward to for a very long time before it came out, largely because we hadn't seen a core mainline Kirby game on a console since Kirby 64. And yes, I know there was the one that was in development for the GameCube that sort of became this game, not really, but it was kind of the culmination of what they were looking to do with that game. But the fact that that GameCube Kirby game never came out in its original form made the wait for Kirby's Return to Dreamland even more noticeable. And as it would turn out, this is one of my favorite games in the series. It's an utterly gorgeous game with vibrant colors, the same fun Kirby gameplay we've come to know and love, and I love the addition of the Super Inhale and the Super abilities that they added to the gameplay. And while storytelling has never really been the most noteworthy part of Kirby, I do think the writing is cute and charming with a solid little twist as well. It's definitely a fun entry in the series, and I'm very happy that it actually got a recent re-release on the Switch last year. I talked about that in my 2023 video, but that re-release is fantastic, and in some ways it feels like an entirely different game, and I definitely recommend checking it out. But whether you get the Wii version or the Switch version, Kirby's Return to Dreamland is absolutely worth a play. And I feel like it's the kind of game that really any audience can jump into and enjoy. Hey, so speaking of what may be unpopular opinions, I'm not 100% sure, but here's a potential another one. Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception was definitely my least favorite of the PS3 Uncharted series. Not every single game, just the ones that came out on PS3. And that's not to say it's not a good game, because it is very good. But it did feel like at times it was lacking in terms of the innovation, meaningful changes that the other two games brought, and it kind of felt like Naughty Dog was going through the motions just a little bit with this one. I believe I've heard that this game was actually being developed by a slightly different team at Naughty Dog because the base team was so busy with The Last of Us, and if that's the case, it does kind of show. But it's definitely still a very good game, and I think it helps that the overall gameplay loop of Uncharted remains compelling with this game. So if you're someone who enjoys the series, you'll definitely feel right at home with Uncharted 3. It's just that it can feel a little bit samey if you play it so close to the other games, which I did since I played them back to back to back. It's still a very good game, one I could definitely recommend playing. Just don't expect it to be quite engaging as Uncharted 2 was. You know, as much as I've talked about Mario games throughout this series, I've barely touched on a lot of the handheld ones. Yes, I talked about the OG New Super Mario Bros., but that feels like it's kind of it. With that said, Super Mario 3D Land was a game I played a lot in my youth, and I remember being very excited for it when it came out. On one hand, it was interesting how it kind of blended the open-ended exploration of a 3D Mario game with the more linear point A to point B design of a 2D Mario game. So it was kind of like playing a 2D game in a 3D plane, which was actually kind of cool. But on the other hand, it was cool to me because it felt like a pretty fully fledged Mario game on a handheld. Even though it was a handheld game, it didn't really feel like I was playing an appetizer, it felt like I was playing a main course. And Nintendo did a really great job with it, bringing a lot of the fantastic level design that makes Mario games so compelling, while also being one of the best uses of 3D on the Nintendo 3DS that I personally experienced. A lot of times, it's pretty clear that the mainline Super Mario games are the games that a Nintendo system is really built around, and I feel like you can feel that with a game like 3D Land. It's definitely one of the best games on the 3DS, and again, it's the kind of game I feel like I could recommend to pretty much anybody. Easy to get into, but still has just enough challenge to stay compelling, and I think no matter what kind of audience you are, you can find something to enjoy in 3D Land. Yes, that's right, another remake/remaster to talk about in this video. That's just what's going to happen as we get further in the series. And Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary was a pretty noteworthy one back in the day. Obviously, this was at a time when Halo sold anything with its face and with its name, and people had not really turned on Halo in different ways and things like that. And we can debate till the cows come home if this counts as a remake or a remaster, but what I will say is that this version of the game is where I got my first experience with Halo, specifically thanks to playing it through the Master Chief Collection. Obviously, I talked about Halo in my 2001 video. It's still a great game despite its age, and the HD visual facelift from this version is fantastic, and I think it was cool to see that they let you kind of toggle between the upgraded visuals and the original visuals. I love when remasters and remakes do that kind of thing, whether it be with the visuals or the music, they let you experience it the old way or the new way. I think that's pretty cool, and it's something I wish more of them did. Oh, and I never tried it for myself, but apparently this game had Kinect integration in it. I have no idea how that works, and I feel like I don't want to know how that works. Though, if someone tells me in the comments, I'm not going to tell you no. Either way, chances are, if you're jumping into the Halo series today, this is probably the version you're going to end up finding, especially since it's the version that's included in the Master Chief Collection. But it's a great version of the game, and even with Halo 1's more dated elements, it's still worth jumping into today. Once more, whether you jump into the original version or the anniversary version, definitely give Halo Combat Evolved a shot, because it's perhaps one of the most important video games to come out, maybe even ever. And lastly, in the cream before the crop, another franchise that made a very big return in 2011, Rayman. After Rayman went off and chased some bunny rabbits in 2006, those bunny rabbits basically took over the planet to the point where they spun off into their own series. You know what I'm talking about, of course. The Raving Rabbits. Rayman was basically removed from his own franchise. The bunnies that I was talking about earlier upended him and took all the spotlight, and they were the new cash cow for Ubisoft. But in 2011, Rayman came storming on back in a 2D platformer, something the franchise had not gone for since the very first game. And in hindsight, this seemed a little bit risky, at least to me, because Rayman's first game, which like I said was a 2D platformer, definitely aged in its own ways. So when I was getting into these games, I was a little worried about trying Rayman Origins, but it turns out it was a very fantastic game. It's a smooth platformer with great level design and combat that manages to be challenging without reaching the overwhelming levels of difficulty that the original game did, and I love how expressive the art style is and how it manages to add its own flavor to the 2D platformer craze, and have its own little sense of humor to it as well. Rayman's always been kind of known for that, and in this game it definitely shows up in spades. This is 2D Rayman done right, and it's a very charming throwback that stands as one of Rayman's best titles. Ubisoft, why haven't you made a new one in over a decade? So that's the cream before the crop, and we're gonna get into the best games. I totally forgot to add another snub at the beginning of the video, because I know when I get through these best games, people are gonna say, why didn't you mention Dark Souls? Because I don't play Souls-like games. Sorry. Okay, now we can get into the best list, and I hate to say but again, but there is one honorable mention. I didn't necessarily want to rank it alongside the other games for reasons that you'll understand when I mention it, but I feel like I can't go through 2011 without mentioning The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D. By all accounts, this could technically count as my favorite game of 2011, but given that it's closer to a remaster than a remake in my eyes, even though it kind of is a remake, I think putting this at the top of the list would be a pretty giant technicality. All things considered, I have no problem putting a remake on my list proper if it's like a ground-up recreation or something like that, like I did in the 2023 video with Dead Space. But if it's just a simple remaster, or if it's a remake that doesn't radically change the game, or it doesn't feel like it's that much different or anything like that, then sometimes I feel like it's too much of a technicality for me to include. Again, that's the wonky thing with remakes, remasters, re-releases, things of that nature. But nevertheless, we all know that Ocarina of Time is the icon of all icons in gaming, and I'd honestly say that the 3DS version might be the way to go as far as playing the game. The frame rate is higher than what it was on the N64, which is nice, the UI is much better, and the addition of the map also makes some of the more challenging dungeons a lot easier to manage. I know a lot of people are thinking that I'm talking about the Water Temple, and yes I am, though honestly, to me, I think there are a lot of hard dungeons in Ocarina of Time. I wouldn't put the Water Temple above many of the other ones. Don't get it wrong, it's definitely challenging, but just not like, oh my god, this is way more challenging than other Zelda dungeons. Of course, you can still play the original version of Ocarina of Time and have a great time, but I think this is the version I'd recommend for someone who is just getting into Ocarina of Time. It was always going to be a challenge to remake or remaster a game that is as beloved as Ocarina of Time, but Nintendo did it about as well as one could. this is definitely an incredible way to preserve a classic. And again, like I said, it's definitely the version of Ocarina I'd recommend trying, but even so, no matter which version you grab, this game is incredible and definitely well worth your time today. Alright, now on to the actual list, and we got 4 10 out of 10 games here. So starting off at the number 4 spot, finally, I'm talking about this series in this part of one of these videos, I gotta go with Mario Kart 7. I bet you're probably thinking, oh, it's about time you talked about Mario Kart in this section of a video. And yes, I've made it embarrassingly clear throughout parts of this series that while Mario Kart is a very popular and well-liked series, and rightfully so, I didn't really come around on it for a very long time. Not out of malice, I did enjoy several of the games, I just didn't really sink crazy hours into many of the previous entries. Mario Kart 7, though, came right at the height of my 3DS excitement. Try saying that 5 times fast. And I distinctly remember as a young teenager being a bit surprised that I put more hours into Mario Kart 7 than I did into Super Mario 3D Land. It just helps that this is a game I didn't want to put down. It was such a tight, fun game with great controls, awesome track design, excellent visuals, especially for a handheld, and some nice changes to the formula that make it such a fun time. I really like the fact that your kart can glide now. I think driving underwater is incredible. I always have fun in the underwater sections of the recent Mario Kart games. And the greater amount of customization of karts is an absolute godsend. Up to this point, Mario Kart was a series I liked, but MK7 was the point where I truly fell in love with it. And would you believe that it would actually get even better from here? But let's hold our horses. We'll talk about that in due time. At number 3, another series that I haven't really gotten to talk about much in this series, I gotta go with Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. I mean, yeah, you could put either version of MVC 3 here, but I'm just going with Ultimate because it's the one that I own on PlayStation and it's the version I play the most. But hey, look, another franchise you guys might be thinking, it's about time to me putting this high on the list. Some of you might be surprised that MVC 2 was a snub in my 2000s video, but sadly, I don't have a lot of experience with that game, a little bit, but not a lot. So, hey, maybe when that MVC collection comes out later this year, I'll play MVC 2 more and then I'll be singing a different tune. One where I get taken for a ride. Okay, obvious reference aside, while my experience with MVC 2 is pretty minimal, I have a solid amount of experience with Marvel vs. Capcom 3. I actually remember the wave of hype that it rode in on being a sequel that came 11 years after its predecessor, so much so that I remember an employee at my local GameStop, which closed down a decade ago, RIP, really heavily pushing my brother and I to pre-order it. We didn't really understand the significance at the time, but we did end up owning the game for a bit on the 360 before years later grabbing it again when it got re-released on the PS4. And I played it a lot growing up between owning it myself and also playing it at friends' houses. It's still a game I go back to a decent bit for some multiplayer fun, and while I don't consider myself very good at it, I still absolutely love it. I love how fast-paced and varied the combat is, the character selection is incredible, and I even have a lot of fun with the arcade mode too. As is fighting game tradition, it's very brief, but it makes up for that by just being incredibly memorable. I may be pretty bad at the game, but that doesn't stop it from being a game I have a lot of fun with. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is a game I have a lot of fond memories with, and it's a shame the series has only gotten one game since this, which we're not going to be talking about because of course not. At number 2, another franchise I love getting its comeuppance with its first 10 out of 10. I gotta go with Sonic Generations. Man, 2011 is the year of me finally giving 10s to franchises I love, isn't it? Yeah, would you believe this is the first time I'm actually giving a 10 out of 10 to a Sonic game? Like I've said in previous videos, Sonic is a very up and down franchise with great highs and just as great lows, but Sonic Generations is a game I still hold up as one of his tightest, most memorable, and most polished games to date. It's got some of Sonic's best level designs, some of his smoothest controls, and some of the best all-around gameplay that the series has ever put up. It's extremely cool to see that this game was able to deliver in the way that it did, mixing 2D and 3D together, and both sides of the coin were great. And yes, I can acknowledge that a game like this, where 2 Sonic variants, one classic and one modern, go through nothing but levels from previous Sonic games, kind of inherently runs on nostalgic pandering, but this is a case where I just kind of fell for that pandering. I mean, I grew up on the Sonic Adventure games as well as Sonic Heroes, so playing the Dreamcast era section of the game was an absolute treat. I smiled all throughout the game like point blank period, but I kid you not when I say that during that particular section of the game, I had a smile on my face that I couldn't wipe off even if I tried. It was so awesome to me that they were able to do what they did with it, and the game as a whole is such a treat. Definitely one of my favorite Sonic games, and I'm super pumped to play it again along with the new side game when Sonic X Shadow Generations comes out later this year. But despite my love of that game, there is still one game that goes slightly higher, and it's one that may actually be a little bit of a surprise. Not because of me, but just because, you know, some people might kind of raise an eyebrow potentially. My game of the year of 2011, my favorite game of the year, I gotta go with The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Matt, what the hell? You finally give a Zelda game Game of the Year and it's the one that a lot of people don't like? Well, hey, remember when I said that I can be unpredictable? Here we are. And by the way, no, putting this here and Ocarina of Time 3D as an honorable mention doesn't mean that I like this game more than Ocarina of Time. I like Ocarina more, of course, but, you know, it's just not an apples-to-apples comparison here. But yes, Skyward Sword is long seen as being one of the most polarizing entries in the Zelda series, and a game many quickly turned on compared to other entries. Granted, yes, Zelda is a very debated franchise. Some games that are very popular have their own brand of haters and all that stuff, and, you know, blah blah blah. But still, Skyward Sword gets a lot of ribbing compared to the other games. Ironically though, not only do I love Skyward Sword, but I'm in that strange boat where I love the game for the reasons that some people don't like it. Personally, maybe it's because I'm a small-brained boy when it comes to puzzles and things of that nature, but I actually don't mind a more streamlined linear Zelda game like this one. A lot of people didn't like that linearity, but I thought the approach actually worked quite well, and the areas themselves were so unique and interesting that I still had an absolute blast exploring them, no matter how linear they were. Also, it's my personal opinion that every Zelda game from Majora through Skyward was basically taking the Ocarina formula and adding some kind of quirk to it, which in this case was flying, and honestly, I fucking loved flying. It was just so much fun exploring the sky, and as someone who tends to rush through my games, it was a rare case where I actually kinda wanted to slow down and just explore everything. And hey, maybe it might be cheating to put this here given that I played it through the HD re-release, but honestly, I'm a sucker for motion controls, and I honestly feel like I would have liked the motion controls in this game, especially with the Wii Motion Plus helping out a lot. Nevertheless, I do recommend the HD re-release because the button controls are perfect, and I think they make the game even better. Yes, I can see the disappointment some have with the game, but like I said, I love it for the reasons that others don't love it. And now that a game like Breath of the Wild has come along and pretty much given fans what they were probably hoping for Skyward Sword to be, maybe now's as good a time as any to give Skyward Sword a second chance if you haven't already. Again, I definitely recommend the HD re-release, but whichever version you go with, I highly recommend Skyward Sword. It's definitely one of my favorites in this excellent series, and as many fantastic games as there were in 2011, and trust me, it was really hard putting this above Sonic Generations, it's definitely worthy of the top of my list. Whew, holy crap, I have been filming for almost an hour. The raw footage on my camera is at 55 minutes right now. It's hot in my room and I'm sweaty, and because of that freak out I did during Skylanders, I actually kind of hurt my throat. So I am feeling it right now, but that was still fun. Talking about the 2011 games was awesome because there were a lot of really good ones. Forewarning, 2012 is going to be a much lighter year than this, but I'm sure there's still going to be some fun ones to talk about then. Nevertheless, of course, this is all my opinion on 2011 as a year in gaming. What were your favorite games of 2011? What did you think of the year as a whole? What were the games that you played the most? Your favorite gaming memories from 2011? And obviously, I have the question of the video prepared and locked in the back of my mind easy here. Since I talked a lot about the 3DS, what were your opinions and experiences with the Nintendo 3DS? Did you get one at launch? Did you wait until later? Did you own the original model? Did you wait till one of the later models came along? And what were some of your favorite 3DS games? Whatever your thoughts, opinions, and experiences are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand. I'm so tired that instead of doing this, I almost put up the peace sign. But yes, the 2012 video will be next. Hopefully, I will be able to film that soon. If not, I'm sorry, life is hella busy, but I will try to continue working on these videos as best as I can with the time that I'm given. Either way, 2012 video coming next. So stay tuned for that, but until then, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.